Imagine attending a funeral, wearing bright white. For many people, that would feel completely wrong, disrespectful, even shocking. But in other parts of the world, white has been the color of mourning for centuries, which raises a strange question. If one culture grieves in black and another grieves in white, who decided which color was right? The surprising answer is that no one ever did. The tradition grew so slowly that most people forgot it had ever been a choice. Today, black feels inseparable from death. But history tells a very different story, one shaped by religion, royalty, fashion, industry, and generations of ordinary people who never realized they were creating one of the world's most recognizable traditions, because the dead never chose black. For most of us, grief has a color, black. It appears so often at funerals that it almost feels inseparable from death itself. But for thousands of years, that simply wasn't true. Across the ancient world, people mourned in remarkably different ways. The ancient Egyptians focused less on the color people wore, and far more on the rituals surrounding burial, preserving the body, and preparing the dead for the journey into the afterlife. Among the ancient Romans, those in mourning sometimes wore darker garments, particularly simple wool togas known as toga pulla. But even there, customs weren't always the same. They changed with time, social status, and local tradition. Travel farther east, and the picture changed completely. In China, Japan, Korea, and many other parts of Asia, white became the color most closely associated with mourning, not because it represented sadness, but because it symbolized purity, the completion of life's journey, and the return to nature. Elsewhere, other cultures followed their own traditions. Some wore purple, some wore gray. Some changed very little about their clothing at all. There was no universal rule, no single color that united the world in grief, because mourning was never really about color. It was about remembering the dead, about honoring a life that had ended. Black was simply one possibility among many. Nothing more, nothing inevitable. But as Europe entered the Middle Ages, one color slowly began gathering a meaning that it had never held before, a meaning that would eventually spread far beyond the people who first embraced it. And centuries later, it would come to define mourning itself. If no one had chosen black, why did it begin appearing at funerals? The answer started long before anyone associated the color with death. During the Middle Ages, black carried a very different reputation. It was the color of seriousness, of discipline, of quiet authority. Religious orders often wore dark robes to symbolize humility, self-denial, and devotion. Judges, scholars, and members of Europe's elite increasingly embraced black as a mark of dignity and respect. But there was another reason the color stood out. True black fabric wasn't easy to make. Creating a deep, rich, even shade required expensive dyes, careful craftsmanship, and repeated dyeing processes. Poorly made black cloth often faded into brown, gray, or purple. Only the wealthy could consistently afford garments that remained a true, luxurious black. In many ways, wearing black became a quiet display of status. It suggested wealth, self-control, and refinement. So when members of Europe's nobility entered periods of mourning, black already carried the qualities they wished to express. Not celebration, not spectacle, but dignity, restraint, respect. No one announced a new tradition. No royal decree declared black the official color of grief. Instead, the custom spread the way many traditions do, quietly. One noble family inspired another. One generation inherited the habits of the last. Little by little, black and mourning became increasingly connected. But even then, the custom belonged mostly to Europe's upper classes. Across villages, towns, and distant cultures, people continued mourning in many different ways. Black had gained a reputation, but it had not yet conquered the world. That would happen because of one funeral that history would never forget. By the middle of the 19th century, black had already become associated with mourning among much of Europe's upper classes. But it was still just one tradition among many. It had not yet become the color that defined grief itself. Then, in 1861, everything changed. Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, died at the age of just 42. The loss devastated her. Those closest to the Queen described a grief that seemed almost impossible to escape. She withdrew from public life. She filled royal residences with Albert's belongings, exactly where he had left them. His rooms were carefully maintained, his clothes remained in place. Even years later, servants continued preparing them, as though he might return. And every time the Queen appeared in public, she wore black. Not for a season, not for a year, but for the rest of her life, for nearly 40 years, the most recognizable woman in the British Empire became a living image of mourning. Millions saw her portraits, read newspaper illustrations, attended royal ceremonies, and watched as black became inseparable from the queen herself. What had once been largely an aristocratic custom now entered everyday society. Manufacturers began producing entire collections of mourning clothing. Department stores advertised garments specifically designed for bereavement. Etiquette books carefully explained how long mourning should last, which fabrics were appropriate, and exactly what people ought to wear. Black wasn't simply fashionable, it had become respectable, a symbol of dignity, love, and remembrance. Queen Victoria had not invented mourning black, but through the extraordinary visibility of her grief, she gave the tradition something far more powerful. She made it the example millions chose to follow. But even an empire could not change clothing forever on its own. Something else was helping carry black mourning far beyond royal palaces and into ordinary homes. A queen may have inspired a tradition, but inspiration alone could never have dressed an entire nation. For that, the world itself had to change. As the 19th century progressed, the Industrial Revolution transformed almost every part of daily life. Factories replaced workshops. Machines replaced much of the slow handwork that had shaped clothing for generations. Garments that once took days to produce could now be made far more quickly and in far greater numbers. At the same time, chemists and textile manufacturers were improving the way fabrics were dyed, producing deep, consistent black cloth became easier, more reliable, and far less expensive than it had once been. A color that had long been associated with wealth was suddenly within reach of ordinary families. For the growing middle class, mourning clothing became something they could actually buy. Department stores began selling ready-made black dresses, coats, veils, hats, and suits, specifically intended for periods of mourning. Even etiquette manuals offered detailed advice. How long should a widow wear black? When was it acceptable to begin wearing gray? When could ordinary colors finally return? Grief had become something society expected people to display, not through words, but through what they wore. What had once been largely the custom of royalty and the aristocracy had quietly become part of everyday life. No law required it, no government enforced it. People followed the tradition because everyone around them did. And as each generation inherited the custom, something remarkable happened. People slowly forgot that black had ever been a choice at all. It simply became the color of mourning. And once a tradition reaches that point, it begins to feel as though it has always existed. Once black became part of everyday mourning, its greatest transformation had only just begun. Children attended funerals and saw their parents dressed in black. Years later, when they buried loved ones of their own, they did exactly the same, not because anyone instructed them to, but because that's simply how mourning was done. One generation passed the custom to the next, then the next, until eventually, a few people stopped to wonder where the tradition had come from. Black no longer felt like a choice. It felt like the natural color of grief. And that may be the most powerful thing about tradition. The longer it survives, the more timeless it appears, the more inevitable it seems. Yet step outside Europe, and a very different story begins to emerge. In China, white has long been the traditional color of mourning, for centuries. It has symbolized purity, the completion of life's journey, and respect for the dead. In many parts of India, white has also remained the color most closely associated with funerals and mourning. Elsewhere, cultures have followed their own customs. Some wear black, some wear white. Some wear colors that reflect entirely different beliefs about life, death, and remembrance. There has never been one universal color of grief, only traditions, shaped by different histories. Which means, black isn't the color of mourning because human beings naturally chose it. It's the color of mourning because history slowly taught millions of people to see it that way. And perhaps, that's the most fascinating part of all. Because once a tradition becomes ordinary, we rarely remember that someone, somewhere, once lived without it. Today, black is so closely connected with funerals that it's difficult to imagine anything else. A black suit, a black dress, a black veil. Without thinking, we understand what they mean. But history reminds us that colors carry no meaning on their own. Black isn't born with sorrow. White isn't born with hope. Purple isn't born with dignity. People give colors their meaning. Then, through generations of repetition, those meanings become traditions. Parents pass them to children. Communities pass them to neighbors. Cultures pass them through centuries. Until eventually, what was once a choice feels as though it has always existed. But history tells a different story. Because the traditions we inherit are rarely inevitable. They are shaped, little by grief, by fashion, by religion, by royalty, by industry. and by millions of ordinary people who simply followed the customs of those who came before them. That's why the same color can mean mourning in one part of the world and celebration in another. Neither is right, neither is wrong. Each is the product of a different journey through history. And perhaps that's the most remarkable lesson of all. The things we think are timeless often have beginnings. The things we assume were inevitable were once simply new ideas, quietly accepted, one generation at a time. Because history isn't only preserved in monuments, or museums, or the pages of old books. Sometimes, it's stitched into the clothes we wear, woven into the traditions we follow, and carried, without us ever noticing, through the smallest details of everyday life. Until someone stops and asks, why?